Well, hello everybody. Good morning or good afternoon. We just waited a minute or two after the hour to give everybody a chance to get logged in. So welcome to the session. We have a full hour of data that Bob and I are going to present. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'd just like to welcome you to the first of 5 webinars we're doing, joint webinars between SafePaaS and ERP Risk Advisors. We are focusing on ERP Armor rules for ERP Cloud. We're focusing really on the ERP Cloud process and testing various access controls using the SafePaaS software. So the goal is to lay a lot of foundational concepts in this session, and I think I've decided to cut it off at role design. So we're going to test one of the 10 scenarios and not get into user provisioning. Just I think because we're going to have a full hour just getting through kind of laying those foundational concepts and just looking at role design. So if you haven't marked your calendar, we'll be doing this series over the next couple of months. Every other week, we're going to do part 2 in 2 weeks from now. And then we'll roll into, I think, early to mid-August before we're finishing all 5 of the parts. And so the 10 different scenarios is what we're going to cover in each of the 5 parts. And there's going to be a little bit of overlap from session to session, but I think you'll gain a lot of knowledge. I think from my perspective, having been in the space for a long time, there's still, I think, a lot of lack of maturity in around the value of access control software like SafePaaS, how it's used, and the different scenarios that are going to be tested. So that's hopefully what you're going to get out of this series. So we have a pretty extensive learning platform we've been building for the last couple of years, and so we have got things for auditors, we've got things for administrators of the application, people that just need to understand the basics of the way the applications work. So it could be like an IT compliance function, or in both financial auditors or IT auditors or security administrators. So we have a bunch of classes already that are already live. All of our classes on our learning platform do come with continuing education. So if you have a certification that requires to continue education, so I always like this, whenever we have a class, I always like to talk about some of the prereqs. And so there's these 3 things that may be beneficial. So depending upon what level of understanding you have of ERP Cloud functionality, some of you may have attended some of the webinars we've done in the last couple of quarters, but there's 3 classes in particular that are available on our learning platform. The first is a webinar that Donna Curtis did. Donna is our ERP Cloud practice manager, and she did one that kind of breaks down what's the role structure look like. So that was from last October. We recorded that, and we have that available. It's called Custom Roles, Data Security Policies, Privileges, Oh My. Let me help you put the puzzle pieces together. And then the next 2 are webinars we did for 23A and 23B. And the 23A one we recorded as of while we did the webinar. 23B, we actually did a purpose-built recording of the slides and launched that with the webinar at the same time. So it is a fully recorded, much more like professional type of webinar you'd see in a learning platform. So what I'm excited to announce right now, I thought I had a slide in this, but I must not have put it in here. But what I'm excited to offer to you guys, if you haven't attended one of these 3 webinars or all 3 of them, we can offer you free CPE. So if you want to email support@erpra.net, so that's our opening a ticket with us. So support@erpra.net, you would have the ability we would enroll you in these classes. And there's one other class I think I forgot to add to the slide that we can enroll you as well, and that is actually a paid class we have called Why Access Controls Must Be Tested for All in-scope systems. So the combination of all 4 of the classes, I think, is 4.5 hours of CPE that we'd be providing to you at no charge if you're interested. So I'll recap with that towards the end, as with the support email as well. Just to remind you, so it's support@erpra.net if you want to take notes. So the agenda for today's class is we're going to look at laying some foundation, I think, that we're going to be using for future classes. So we're talking about what are SOD conflicts and what are sensitive access, the definition of that. A lot of you probably know what that is. Talk about our rule set. So the advanced rule set that we have that's comprehensive and updated every quarter, called the ERP Armor. So we're talking about that, what elements should be in a good rule set for testing on an ongoing basis. And then the 10 components that we're going to look at, the 10 different scenarios of testing access controls. Some of you have also heard me talk about determining what rules are relevant, or what we call in-scope rules. We're going to walk through how that's done, and then we're going to look a little in detail at the first scenario of the 10, which is testing role design. So that's kind of our agenda. So I like to start with a broad understanding of the risks that should be monitored via access control software. And I think for the most part, I think I'd say the audit community and management is so heavily focused on compliance. So when we think of compliance in the U.S., it's Sarbanes-Oxley. There are similar compliance legislations throughout the world. JSOX, there's UK SOX that's coming. There's similar requirements in just different jurisdictions. But you know, us being a U.S. focused organization, and really a lot of our business is around helping companies prepare for Sarbanes-Oxley compliance and respond to it, or the similar, JSOX and other UK SOX initiatives throughout the world. What we find is that the focus is so heavily on the compliance that there's a lot of the other areas where risks need to be monitored that organizations don't fully take advantage of the capabilities of the SafePaaS software to be able to test access controls. So access controls are much more than compliance, and I think that'll become obvious as we go through the discussion. So we look at the other buckets. Fraud. Fraud is certainly part of compliance, but there's we think of it as like sub-material fraud versus material fraud. So the concept of materiality comes into play with Sarbanes-Oxley, whereas management is much more inclined to be risk averse related to any fraud. So even smaller frauds, $10, $20, $50,000 frauds, which might not necessarily rise to the level of a material misstatement risk, depending upon how your controls are defined. So we just differentiate between sub-material fraud and material fraud. And so we want to make sure that management has a good awareness of how to prevent and detect fraud, regardless of the size. There's operational risk. So if depending upon what your organization does, that's going to vary significantly. If you're a manufacturing organization, things like bill of materials, item master, for example, might not raise to the level of critical access or SOD issues when you get into access control or role design from a Sarbanes-Oxley perspective, but it's certainly something that your COO and your C-suite in general, like if there's a change to a bill of materials, for example, somebody has an unauthorized change, they make a change to a bill of materials, and that then drives either over purchasing or some problems with the way the manufacturing floor runs, then that's certainly going to be a risk that management wants to address. Cybersecurity, it's a different world right now for sure. There's lots of cybersecurity threats going on, both for on-prem applications and SaaS applications. For ERP Cloud, it's a SaaS application, so effectively the perimeter, so to speak, securing the perimeter and external threats is really the domain of Oracle, and they're supposed to be taking care of that. And so far, what they've been doing is held up. But cybersecurity also is something management needs to look at in terms of how are they securing the account. So the SaaS applications like NetSuite, Workday, and ERP Cloud are internet facing. So how do you have SSO and MFA configured? Are all users subject to multi-factor authentication, for example, and your internal SSO controls like Active Directory setups, or you're maybe using a product like SafePaaS to be able to leverage your identity management controls? If that's the case, then you have to ask yourself the question, where are the vulnerabilities? And what we'll often see for ERP Cloud is, a lot of the internal employees will typically have an SSO and MFA configuration related to it. So there is, multi-factor authentication provides a strong deterrent against somebody taking over internal credentials. But there are cases, there are aspects or certain components of the users that don't necessarily have that same standard, so that maybe they have a local login. And for example, if you are pushing out a supplier portal and suppliers can manage their own accounts, so they can register, manage their own accounts, submit invoices and that kind of thing through supplier portal, then those same suppliers may not be subject to the same MFA controls as you would for the rest of your employees. And so that provides a different level of risk from a cybersecurity perspective. And there are many cases we've heard where external suppliers have given up their credentials through a phishing attack, had the threat actor come in, make changes to bank accounts, and redirect subsequent supplier payments to a fraudulent account. So you can't just say cybersecurity is ransomware and just forget the fact that, or you think that Oracle has everything covered. Cybersecurity is certainly ransomware that Oracle is covering, but it is the potential for fraud, and it's a potential for the theft of data. So how you secure those accounts and who has access to what components, supplier master maintenance, FBDI privileges, the ability to develop BI admin reports or OTBI reports to be able to pull data. Those are all cybersecurity threats that management should be evaluating in the context of SaaS applications, ERP Cloud in particular. The next thing in terms of risk we like to think about from an access control perspective is licensing. And you can always kind of tell when Oracle's starting to miss their sales numbers because they start cannibalizing their own customer base, and they go after and are becoming a little bit more aggressive on the license audit side. And we just got back from Ascend. I know Bob was there as well. And what was interesting about the Ascend conference, the OATUG conference this year, was everybody was talking about licensing. Everybody was talking about custom roles, and the need for fully customized roles to address both risk issues and licensing issues. Whereas a couple of years ago, I think we were like 3 years ago, I think we're one of only 2 presentations on that topic, or one of those topics, either custom roles or licensing. At Ascend right now, there's lots of people talking about it. It was kind of the buzz of the conference is how do we customize roles to avoid licensing risks? So there's significant licensing overages, and certainly that's part of what we have in ERP Armor is the ability to test those the privileges related to license buckets that on an ongoing basis Oracle's looking at to be able to determine whether you have license overages. So we're seeing a lot more interest in clients and through our partners of customizing roles or further customizing roles to limit who has access to various privileges that are driving license buckets. Is that a risk? It is, in that you could have a fairly significant financial hit in a quarter if you can't remediate those things, and Oracle decides to become aggressive on your overusage of certain buckets. So bottom half of the screen, I'm not going to go through in a lot of detail, but you can see like there's a lot of the C-level suite is going to be concerned about various different types of risks in an organization. Sometimes we think of the CFO as the primary driver behind SOD and sensitive access type access control software and programs, but certainly the CIO cares about it, maybe more so from a licensing perspective than a compliance perspective. The CISO, certainly from a cyber perspective, you may have a SOX PMO, and even the chief operating officer is going to be concerned about access controls. So a program that is built and maintained for testing and managing access controls on an ongoing basis should be something that you are helping the entire C-suite manage, and not just focus on just compliance as a risk as a whole. So in this next section, I want to go through and define SOD conflicts and sensitive access risk. I think there's probably a lot of people here that are veterans in the field that know these concepts fairly well. But I think what I'm gonna try to emphasize in this is there's too much emphasis on segregation duties and not nearly enough emphasis, nearly as much emphasis that needs to be placed on sensitive access risks. So we're going to talk about that in the context of role design validating that roles don't have access to something they shouldn't in this section. We're going to certainly talk about SOD conflicts in subsequent sessions, but my opinion is you have, during the implementation, what typically happens is roles are designed to be able to make sure they do the jobs that are necessary for a system to go live. There's not a lot of negative regression testing asking the question, do roles have access to things they shouldn't? So SIs really aren't set up to be able to do that negative regression testing. They don't really care about that negative regression testing as part of the implementation. All they care about is they can go live and the people that can do their jobs after going live. It's not the concern of an SI typically to say, do they have access to something they shouldn't? That's just not the role of an SI. Management needs to be aware of that is a risk to the project, and that's what I would consider a systemic issue within the context of the SI industry. They're focused on functionality and hitting their goals and go live. And unless you have an audit organization coming in and making sure that management is aware that a lot of the roles, either the seated roles or partially customized roles, are potentially or probably going to have things that don't belong in them, then often an organization will go live with a significant amount of risk from a I'm gonna call it a sensitive access perspective, which could bleed into SOD conflicts as well. But also there's a significant amount of risk that management is taking with an over provisioning of privileges that lead to license risks. How do we avoid that during a project? We avoid that through having a very, very detailed set of rules that look at sensitive access risks within roles. So that's what we're really going to talk about today, is how do we validate that role design pre-go live in an ideal scenario is appropriate. Nobody has access to something they shouldn't, and that is through a very extensive sensitive access analysis looking at what's within the roles. So just to reiterate kind of the definitions of what these are, SODs, segregation duties, are two activities when they combine have a certain risk associated with them. So it's the combination of two business processes, or if I think about the buckets of access controls as transactions, configurations, and master data. So it could be two transactions, it could be it could be master data and a transaction, it could be configuration, even a configuration in a transaction, which we'll talk about as a particular grouping of rules that we look at as well. So some examples here. The first example, enter and maintain suppliers versus enter and maintain payables invoices. Suppliers being master data, invoices being a transaction against a supplier. So you have trying to separate from a fraud perspective those two. I think you guys probably get these concepts fairly easily. The second example, enter suppliers, enter maintain purchase orders. Those are two kind of default things that everybody talks about in a base rule set. Third example, enter maintain users, enter and maintain roles. That might be an SOD risk that gets evaluated because you may have a separate group entering and maintaining roles, so customizing roles or modifying them from the user provisioning team. So you could have a security team that does provisioning, and then a business analyst team that's responsible for maintaining roles and going through the change control process. What's interesting about that one as an example is we as an organization, as we are evaluating security, don't really look at this from an SOD perspective. We're going to look at each aspect individually. And so I'm going to talk about now why we take a sensitive access risk approach first and an SOD approach second. So if I look at enter and maintain users and enter and maintain roles, both are significant risks. I don't want to have anybody that has access to enter and maintain users that shouldn't, and I don't want to have anybody having access to enter and maintaining roles that shouldn't. So if I do a sensitive access analysis across all roles, and I say, tell me every user and role that has access to enter and maintaining users. So it's primarily an element or a component of the security console. And if I get that right, and then if I do the separate analysis, enter and maintain roles, and I verify that only the right people have access to that activity, are assigned a role that has that access, and I get that right, then I don't have a conflict that I haven't not accepted. So there are cases where there is a security team, like enter maintain users and enter maintain roles is in security console, right? So sometimes management does say the same people are going to provision users as provisioning or maintaining roles. But as long as I verify that the users are the same, and there are really individual risks. The risks is, provisioning a user that shouldn't have access or wasn't approved. The risk is on the maintain role size, maintaining role, modifying a role that's inappropriate. It gives somebody access to something they shouldn't. Two different risks. And if I'm looking at the combination of these risks, I'm really not adding more risk by the combination of the two if I've accepted the fact that a particular user can do both functions. So on the IT side, very different analysis, risk analysis than you would on the functional side. But point being, on the IT stuff, like enter maintain users, enter maintain roles, and configurations, we predominantly look at those as sensitive access risks first and ask the question: does anybody have access to these abilities that shouldn't? We do the same really on the functional side as well, like vendor master maintenance. Vendor master maintenance is always an in-scope sensitive access risk because of the ability to set up a new vendor that's fraudulent, or more importantly, modify an existing vendor by redirecting a payment to either a fraudulent bank account, or if they're using checks, making a change to the name or the address and have that check be sent to somebody that should not have access and custody of that check. So that's a functional example of a sensitive access risk that should be always tested and should be always part of an in-scope rule set on an ongoing basis. And then there are some systems, frankly, like if I was having a discussion from an EBS perspective, purchase orders would be a sensitive access risk that's really critical, because EBS has the ability to define a configuration and document types that says owner can approve, which means some buyers can approve their own purchase orders. So they could, in theory, commit fraud in and of themselves just by having access to the purchase orders form, depending upon how document types or configurations or was configured. So there are cases where you really have to understand the way the system works and the way it's designed. And I'll go through some more examples as we're going through this, because even in a case where you think that workflow is governing the risk, looking ahead a little bit to some of them, stealing thunder in a couple of slides, you still have the ability to convert data or interface data through FBDI abilities that are often, if not always, not always subject to workflow approval process. So even if you think you have a mitigating control for certain activities, there are ways to web services, APIs, and FBI abilities. HCM data loader would be another example, where there are processes that are bypassing what you think you're perceiving as your mitigating controls. So sensitive access risks are very important, and I think as I talk about why sensitive access risk first and SOD second, I'm gonna go through an example here. If I'm looking at SOD risks, so if I'm looking enter suppliers, enter payable invoices, or enter suppliers, enter purchase orders, and I think of that as my primary risk from a fraud perspective, and I don't think about sensitive access risk, enter suppliers in and of itself, then I'm missing a risk associated with enter suppliers, right? So I may care about suppliers and payables invoices, but if I don't also independently test enter suppliers, then I'm missing addressing the risk related to the fraudulent update of an existing supplier, like by changing the default bank account. So the other important aspect of this, of course, that I think a lot of practitioners understand the space is you also need to understand if workflow process has been implemented. And I would say 95 times out of 100, if not 99 times out of 100, a workflow process is going to be implemented such that a person that initiates a transaction is not going to be able to approve their own transaction. That's kind of like, that's 101 from a controls design and a workflow design perspective. So my example here on this, so we have SOD risks and we have sensitive access risks, and how we walk through this with our clients is we would look at enter suppliers first, and the first question we ask is, are you using supplier approval workflow? And the question is yes, and the question is the second question is there an ability to enter a supplier? Is the workflow designed in such a way, or are there other privileges that somebody has access to that would not be subject to the supplier approval workflow? So we need to address those risks on the front end, and if we can resolve that nobody, let's say nobody has FBDI abilities or enter suppliers, so the workflow is designed in such a way that all entry of suppliers and changes to suppliers, because it's not just entry, but it's also changes, like changing a bank account, has to go through the workflow approval process. Then I've potentially addressed fully mitigating the risk related to the entry of suppliers because of the fact that I have workflow properly designed, and I don't have anybody that has abilities like FBDI abilities that don't have that bypass workflow approval process. So if I address sensitive access risk first, when I get to the segregation duty side of this, I've already effectively defined what my risks are for suppliers. And if it's fully mitigated through workflow, as an example, then I don't really care if somebody has to enter suppliers, enter payables, invoices, because suppliers is really a fully mitigated control. So from my perspective, I scope out the SOD risks, enter suppliers versus enter payables, invoices, because I have an effective mitigating control related to suppliers. Now I'm going to continue to go back to this, but there's always a but, right? So even though my workflow is in place, I always have to ask myself, have I secured the elements that bypass the workflow process? And this is where I think a lot of designers on the front end pre-implementation don't fully appreciate or address the risks, or auditors don't think about the bypass process as it's really a separate risk. The one risk is really mitigated by a workflow process. The second risk is mitigated by role design. I have to mitigate it through role design. So that's why we address, when we're working through a project with the client or our customers, we're always addressing sensitive access risk first, and then we'll come back and then see what's left over, what is residual risk, if you will, where we're combining activities, and look at SOD risk second. So I'm going to talk about our rule set, which is can be packaged with SafePaaS software, and we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of both how we build rules and then the components of it. So from a rule set perspective, you have 3 different types of security objects, if you will, in the context of ERP Cloud that need to be secured and understood who has access to them. There's privileges. People understand what those are, where that's the core security component that provides either somebody the ability to view data or update data, or a combination of the two provides update data. There are duty roles, and there are some aspects of the application where duty roles don't have privileges in them, or a duty role in of itself has risk that you can't test through a privilege. And then there are data security policies. And data security policies, think about it as common level security. There are other aspects and examples of that, but effectively, it's more fine-grained security above and beyond just access to the privilege in and of itself. And then the fourth component of rules building or access control risks is combinations of segregation duties risks built into SOD conflicts. So when I talked about sensitive access first, there's actually 3 different aspects of sensitive access that should be tested: privileges, duty roles, and data security policies before you get into testing SOD conflicts at all. So some examples here of privileges mapped to sensitive access risks. So I've given you specific privileges. If you guys are practitioners of the space or management would understand, it's fairly easy to identify, like what can enter a journal, what can enter a journal by spreadsheet, what can maintain a bank statement, and so on. So I've given you both the internal name here and the external name, not rocket science. The one thing I think that people often overlook is APIs and web services, and even like flex fields, like descriptive flex fields. They're in a lot of seated functional roles. So what would this look like using SafePaaS software to be able to test, let's say, administer security profiles, which is one of many security profiles that define security. I would run an analysis on HP 006, and I would ask the software to tell me all roles that have that ability. And then as I looked at the roles that have that ability, I would ask myself the question: what is the intent of the role? And are the roles that have access to that ability that would not be appropriate? So for that, in HP 006, for example, that would be something I'd expect to go through change control. It's going to define security from an HCM perspective at the role level. So I'm defining a data role applied to a job role, and I'm applying the context, security context associated with it. So I would expect that to go through change control. So when I run a sensitive access analysis in around HP 006, I'm going to look to see if there are any end user roles or roles that I expect only to be assigned to end users that have the ability to administer security profiles. If I find that, then I would say that role has a flaw in it. If I've got a bunch of people in HCM or payroll or financials, even financials roles that have the ability to enter or maintain a configuration that is subject to change control, that to me is a design flaw in the role. REST services and APIs is a good example. There are a ton of financial roles that have access to APIs, the FSCM API process. I would not expect any end users to need or have access to API processes. HCM functionality requires it, financials and supply chain doesn't. So it's a weird scenario, and it's not always clear from Oracle as to whether or not APIs are necessary for the user interface activity. So that's what I'm talking about. Is HCM requires APIs to be able for the UI to work. The financials, pretty much the rest of the modules don't. So when we're looking at APIs and web services, even though they're in a bunch of financials roles or supply chain roles, we have to pull those out because it would not be appropriate for people, even though it may be technically a little more of a challenge to figure out how to use those because you have to pull like Postman down or something like that. What you'd want is to customize those roles so the risk was removed from an end user perspective. So first example, privileges mapped to sensitive access rules. There are cases where duty roles provide a risk in and of themselves. So we have a couple of different duty roles mapped to BPM workflow, which is the design of workflow through the BPM process. And the subject areas we have mapped. Subject areas sometimes provide access to certain data that would not be appropriate for all users, so more extensive access risk. Item master maintenance is also driven by a duty role. Data security policies. If you're familiar with, if you come from an EBS environment, these are what are called grants. So I think it's actually the same table. F&D grants table contains these in ERP Cloud. DSPs are a challenge, and they're becoming more increasingly important in terms of the abilities they have to drive the way the security is designed throughout the application. And then the last of this is pairs of sensitive access risks built in SOD conflicts. We were on a project recently, and I'm not gonna name a Big Four firm, but I'm gonna pick on this project that I was on recently, and we're kind of playing QA in this project for a company, and the firm that was implementing it's basically the same firm is doing the SI work that is doing security design work, which sometimes I really think should be separated. I think it's like the fox watching the hen house, having the SI and doing both the risk advisory work, the security design work, and the SI work, the core SI, the functionality work. But what was interesting about this client is the SI partner was implementing Oracle's advanced access controls. They bought Risk Management Cloud, and they were implementing the advanced access controls module to be able to test access controls. And knowing what we do, which we build risk content, including SOD and sensitive access, the rules on an ongoing basis, I asked them to ask this firm, can you give us an understanding of what rules are implemented? What are you going to be testing in advanced access controls to verify that your roles are built appropriately? And the response this firm gave, which is a Big Four firm, they said they gave them a list of SOD conflicts, and they gave them no sensitive access risks. So as I've just gone through this presentation, and I described how, from a role design perspective, you really should be focusing on like who has security profiles, who has enter journals, who has cache management abilities, who has REST APIs, and that is testing role design by sensitive access risks. not through SOD conflicts. SOD conflicts are an aggregation of risk through multiple things being provided, but you cannot effectively test role design only through SOD rules. So I was kind of shocked because in the SOW, or in this, well, I'm not sure it was in the SOW, but effectively this firm was only going to use SOD conflicts to be able to test quote unquote access control risks, which leaves out the entire, how do I make sure that roles don't have access to something they shouldn't, which is that cross-role analysis, the negative regression testing, if you will, that happens, that should be happening as part of the role design process to confirm that a role, although it might be able to do what it's supposed to do, doesn't have access to something it should not do, which is what you're doing by testing sensitive access rules. So, and I'm not saying that all the Big Four have this. There's just one particular one, and I'm not going to name who they are, but I think that's a question you have to ask as management as you're going through these projects is, number one, should you even have the same firm do the same those activities? Because it is a little bit like the fox watching the hen house. Number two, how is their approach going to ensure at the end of the day when you go live, validated through your UAT process, that people don't have access to something they shouldn't? And I mean, I will just emphasize this. I think it is the wrong decision for management to have somebody build security or provide a risk advisory role on a project as the same as an SI. If you have two different groups from the same company and the SI team is not doing their job, the likelihood that the risk advisory team is going to call that out against their own internal company is pretty small. It's going to be a little bit of having each other's back and making sure that the project looks appropriate to them, even though it may not be the right thing for the company. This next section here is another good foundational section. I think for those of you that I know I've done other webinars with SafePaaS in the past, we talked about this concept of determining what are in-scope rules. And so this is another really important part of then determining, like, what am I going to be testing against roles, both from a sensitive access and an SOD perspective on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to go back to some of these things, driving forces behind access control testing. There's regulatory requirements, cybersecurity, there's data security, there's fraud, there's license overages, there's operational risks, and then I'm throwing all that into a bucket of, it's really part of IT general controls, with IT application controls being a subsection of that. So IT application controls are, I think it's like the perfect storm in the audit community. Very difficult to audit. I mean, I could spend an hour probably talking through kind of some systemic issues in the way that IT application controls are implemented and audited. But I wanted to at least reset and say, we're not just talking from a scoping perspective. A lot of focus is on quote unquote compliance requirements, and 95% of the effort from a compliance perspective is often just looking at SOD risk. Does somebody have the ability to enter a supplier and enter invoice? Do they have the ability to enter a customer and enter an order, or enter a customer, enter an invoice against that order without going through order management? And those are all probably issues that need to be addressed from a testing perspective. So now I'm gonna kind of take off I have to be concerned about everything. I'm going to really kind of dive into thinking about Sarbanes-Oxley compliance and compliance requirements, but I don't want to I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that we should be testing for other things like cybersecurity risks, who has APIs and web services, or who has the ability to mass upload data via HCM data loader or FBDI processes bypassing workflow, who has data security risks. We should be concerned about those, right? And so I'm not trying to transition away and say those aren't important, but I do want to talk about when we end up helping a company scope what's really relevant from an external compliance perspective, and I'm thinking Sarbanes-Oxley or something similar. How do we do that so that we are not we're addressing really that as a requirement independent, because that's really what a lot of companies get audited under is Sarbanes-Oxley, and that is a lower bar than, you know, including all these other initiatives, cyber, data security, fraud, and other things in them. An external auditor coming to look at a SOX perspective is I don't know, maybe half of the risk an organization needs to address. I don't know exactly what the percentage would be, but so having said that, the audit industry really doesn't, in my opinion, isn't mature still in this area. And I'm going to go through this decision tree that I developed a couple years ago. And it's really about evaluating the risk and control matrix. It's saying if management's defined the controls in my risk and control matrix to be able to predominantly comply with us from an ICFR SOX perspective, how do I, as a practitioner in this space, determine what are my relevant SOD and sensitive access risks that I should be testing and be presenting that? Because Sarbanes-Oxley is all about management's assessment of risk, and then the auditors come in and validating the completeness of that assessment and the accuracy of the assessment as it's been implemented in terms of operating effectiveness of design and operating effectiveness. So you really should be starting from the risk and control matrix. And that's, I could spend an hour talking about the lack of maturity in building risk and control matrices. You'd expect within firms and across firms, like risk is risk, and how we're defining a risk control matrix should be consistent. So what data goes in, the risk population should be, you would think it should always be complete, which is really not the case. Again, I could spend a half an hour talking about that. But the reality is, if you are working on doing an sensitive access report or a presentation or analysis, either on behalf of management, either using software or not using software, no matter what you're doing, you should be asking the question, what is it that should be testing and why? And that really comes down to looking at how management's assess risk and evaluating the risk and control matrix, and then mapping from there to what the controls are. So the first question I was asked is the control listed as a manual control? Just because it's listed as a manual control doesn't necessarily mean it is a manual control. It could have some dependency on the system. So I would say, does the control require a report to execute the control? So it really is kind of two categories of manual controls, if you want to think about it. When you think about a manual control, it could be something outside the system, like management's establishing a process for building a budget, and that happens on spreadsheets, and there's an approval process, or they rebaseline the budget and they use that for forecasting, and those are things that are used for budget to actual or forecast to actual or flux analysis and those type of things. But then there are cases where there's a control being executed in a manual fashion by pulling a report from the system and then taking a population, or maybe a complete execution of the control. Like supplier masters is an example where every insert, update, or delete should be traced back to the source documents. Or it could be that management is taking like a report of credit memos and taking a population of those and validating that the credit memo was properly authorized before it was entered. That's an area right now that is not really deemed to be an IT dependent control. But I wrote an article on this, and I wrote an article recently called why control performer access, I forget what it's called exactly, but anyways, I wrote an article recently talking through the process of people that are executing the control, how they should be independent of the control, and how you'd have to go through the process of verifying that the control performer, which is also thinking about you may have heard the terminology control owner or control approver, the person that's executing or people that are executing the control should not have access to the activities they're overseeing, because that obviously would undermine their independence. So a big part of why Sarbanes-Oxley was put into place was management overriding controls. And I've made the argument in this article I wrote recently that auditors aren't testing to confirm that management cannot override controls, that they are independent of their control. And this is, like, I think, a massive systemic issue in and flaw in the way that internal and external auditors are executing their audits. And it comes down to, if they have a manual control they're overseeing, so like a CFO pulls a report about credit memos and they take a population of those and verify that they're all properly authorized, but the CFO himself or herself actually has access to enter a credit memo, then they cannot, their independence has been compromised, they cannot perform that control if effectively they're performing the control over themselves. Or saying it another way, if they have the ability to override the control, then they should not be the control performer or the person that's testing that control. So I've got an article on that if you're interested in diving into that in more detail. I would say if there's some auditors on the call that you're going to be like, there's just no way that's possible because that was such a critical element of Sarbanes-Oxley's implementation 20 plus years ago. And I'm telling you, like, I think it is a systemic flaw in the entire audit community. So that's a whole nother side topic, but so if a controls this as a manual control and it's usually required to execute the control, then that is an IT dependent control based upon you want to verify that effectively that the control performer doesn't have access to the data they have, which should be done through access control software. So there are other, when people think about IT dependent controls, it's typically entering and maintaining data. So it's either relying upon a configuration or relying upon a specific access control, like the control might say people that enter and maintain suppliers cannot enter and maintain purchase orders or invoices. So it's more of a access control related. So data entry is restricted. And ultimately, what you need to be doing is also then going through the process and saying, is there a workflow governing the activities here in the maintenance of data, and should there be subject, and has the workflow been properly designed to separate the preparer and approver of those transactions? So I'm going to skip through this. I think this is again a longer conversation, and I do cover this in some of the classes we have on our learning platform in a little more detail. But you can have a application control is configurable. You should be testing the configuration, and you have an access control that's dependent upon access controls or a control that's IT dependent control that's dependent upon access controls. A lot of times when we get into the details of whether a workflow can be relied upon, the walkthrough process, I believe, is either flawed or not complete, depending on how you look at it. And this is getting to how the systems are implemented. There's an assumption that the SI's goal is to be able to verify that people can do their job when they go live. There's not often negative regression testing, and where negative regression testing isn't being done is asking the question, do people have access to something they shouldn't? And so what's normally happening in the test of one, or the test of the workflow process, is they're validating that the workflow is designed to do what it's intended, to separate the entry and approval of transactions. And then there's certain other characteristics, like do people have the right approval limits for purchase orders and consistent with management's policies. But negative regression testing, if negative regression testing were done as part of that process, they would be asking the question, do they have web services or APIs or FBDI abilities or HCM data layer abilities that allow them to override the workflows? And every SaaS system is going to have those abilities within them. Inherently, they have to convert data, and they have to provide a way to interface data. And conversion of data and interface data is coming from other systems are 99 times out of 100 not going to be subject to the workflow process in the target system. But yet we don't see management having testing that process as part of that. We don't see internal auditors fully and completely testing that. We don't see external auditors fully and testing that. What we're seeing the audit community do is a test of one, verifying the workflow design is done, and they ignore the fact that there are objects like privileges and duty roles that people have access to that can bypass the workflow. So it's either this test isn't sufficient or they're not addressing the risks, but it is a pretty significant flaw in the way that security is being designed as part of implementation, and security is being audited by internal and external auditors pre and post implementation, that leaves management with a lot of risk post go live that they're not even aware of. So just to recap here, what rules are relevant. There's a lot of sensitive access rules that really should be relevant prior to this, prior to testing, negative regression testing. I've talked about this. I think I really talked through like what roles are wholly mitigated through the workflow design. And What I want to get into just in recap right now is recap, like I've talked about the concept of having to do a lot of sensitive access testing. Access control software like SafePaaS software, there's 10 different scenarios where access control should be tested. Role design, we're just recap that in this session. It should be used during provisioning, during user access reviews, when a role is changed, when a patch is applied to the environment, when development is moved into production, even in SaaS environments because of the risk of sensitive data. You're not customizing the applications. When there's a cyber incident, to test the independence of control performers, to perform look-back procedures, and to evaluate license exposure. Most people think, if they think about the use of SafePaaS software and rules like what we have, ERP Armor, they think I have to test role design, and I want to have some process in place for evaluating risk during user provisioning. These other 8 scenarios, they're not even applying the software or the content to be able to test these because they don't think that they're relevant. But I would say they are relevant from a SOX perspective, and they're very, very relevant to the entire C-suite on all the things we talked about that's near and dear to their heart. So when we're implementing a product like SafePaaS, what we do from a role design perspective is we look at every rule that we have, every sensitive access rule we have, other than a couple of buckets. We have rules for page abilities. So a page ability is generally going to provide just somebody access to inquire on data. So we remove those. Most of the duty roles that we have, not all of them, are focused on reporting areas. So we have the ability to know if people have access to certain data they shouldn't. And then we also have a series of rules related to licenses. So we can do a license analysis based upon privileges that roll up to license buckets. So what we typically do, what we have pre-built for our partnership with SafePaaS is we have a mega tag that includes all sensitive access risks and SOD conflicts other than these abilities, so that we can holistically look at everything a role has access to, not just everything it has access to, but the things that we can point out that have a risk where they shouldn't have access to. So that's where the negative regression testing is done and the concept of role design. And that's what we do pre-go live, and we would do and we actually kind of apply that same process to patches, and when a patch is applied on a quarterly basis, and when roles are modified during the change control process. And the nice thing about SafePaaS is they really have the ability to do tags. So we build, we have a lot of different types of tags, so the groupings of rules. We have a massive subset of rules. And then what we end up doing, if we want to look at what's in a role design, is we have a couple different things we'll look at. We would look at what rules are violated within a given role. So like, for example, AP Invoice Supervisor, it has a rule that we built, create and maintain SLA journals, which has 2 different privileges in it. That's a journal entry function, has some import processes, has some interface processes, has ability to load file interfaces, it has some web services. So we can look at it from a what we call role rule perspective, and we also look at it from a role privilege or role privilege duty role perspective, where we can actually see individual components like import payables invoice, FBDI, import payables payment request, FBDI. Does it really belong in a supervisor role? If so, what controls do you have? Manage subledger journal entry manually, that's one of the 2 things that we roll up into this create manual SLA journal entries. So that's what you should be doing, or you should be expecting from your internal auditors. Hopefully, you don't want that to get to the external audit level to be able to verify role design. I'm way over on time, and I just say Bob has prepared a few demos for us that I think we're going to probably just, for lack of time right now, push those off to the next training session. But the nice thing about the SafePaaS platform, the team has been around for a long time. They really understand the Oracle environment in particular. They've got expertise in other areas, but they really understand the Oracle environment well. They've got very mature product, and through our risk content, ERP Armor, which we do license through SIs, license to SIs and audit firms. So we have a partner network of companies that we work and build our product, just like SafePaaS does. There's a lot of value in using the software to more comprehensively test access controls. And what we're going to do in the subsequent sessions, part 2 we're still developing, but part 2 is going to have to include user provisioning. I didn't get to that. And we will do a demo of how to run those rule tags. That's really what we do, is we have this mega rule tag pre-built. We run the rule tag that gives us the ability to look at lots of sensitive access rules and all the SOD rules that are relevant, and that gives us the ability to do export the data and look at pivot tables and see what is wrong in a role or roles. That gives management the ability to say, are our roles properly designed pre-implementation? If not pre-implementation, hopefully post-implementation. So a little over. I guess I don't know if there's any questions. Bob, I covered a lot. I know you probably wanted to make some comments on this, and I apologize I've gone long, but do you have any thoughts or comments on what we've covered at this point, Bob?
No, that's fine. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and if you join the next sessions, we'll be able to cover those demonstrations that Jeff had mentioned, and it'll cover the topics around sensitive access, segregation of duties, roles design, and provisioning. So we can cover those then. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you have a specific need right now, and you guys want to talk through how we can partner together to accelerate your program, you don't have to wait till the next webinar to have it. We can certainly work on a joint demo that helps figure out how to help mature your overall program. So in recap, we have 4 more sessions coming up. So we're gonna dive into this a little more detail. We have a monthly newsletter. If you're interested, you can call the Risk Revolution, your PM Risk Revolution. And then I mentioned there's the prerequisites in a class we have called Why Access Control Should Be Tested for All in-scope system. It's an hour-and-a-half class that is a paid class for us. If you're interested in getting access to that, we are providing that free to companies that want to have access to that today. And then the prerequisites I went through in the very beginning, these other 3 classes, if you want access to those, it's 4.5 hours of CPE that give you some good foundation for some of the concepts we talked today. You can email us at open a ticket for us by emailing support@erpra.net. And if you guys have want to see a demo of the functionality or dive into these in more topic, you can reach out to Bob or Emma or the team at SafePaaS. So thanks for your time. We'll see you all in 2 weeks. If you guys have any questions or comments, and is there something we didn't cover that you want to see covered in subsequent sessions, please reach out as well. And otherwise, we'll hopefully see you guys in 2 weeks on our next session. Thank you.
Thank you.